When one thinks about the action figures that helped define many childhoods, it's only natural to look back to their vintage origins. For some, this may go as far back to the very creation of the action figure term itself in the 1960s. For many, their formative action figure memories ran through the prosperous period of the 1970s and 1980s, and for others, this extended into the 1990s and the 2000s. Today, in the modern era of toy collecting, new intellectual properties have joined the ranks of action figure options when you're shopping for the latest aesthetically pleasing item to add to your collection. The very hobby itself has evolved from one centered around playability to one more focused on displayability, and thus our purchasing options have leveled up accordingly. Many would say that the best modern example of this is Mythic Legions. Founded by the company Four Horsemen Studios, Mythic Legions was introduced to the world via the Kickstarter platform back in 2015 and delivered its opening wave the following year. Thus, in many ways, Four Horsemen Studios have paved the way for new independent companies to enter the action figure mix, drawing inspiration from a successful company that now offers a massive range of products set in their fictional realm of Mythos. Perhaps you've already heard about Mythic Legions. Maybe you even collect the line. Or, if this is your first time hearing about it, well, let's just say that it's as good a time as any to go back and revisit how it all started and why this is such a fun toy line to collect. Let's begin. The brilliance of Mythic Legions, along with its various races, factions, and overall themes, are the conception of the aforementioned Four Horsemen Studios. You can have a look at some of the names of past and present company members by simply surfing Wikipedia, though credit should also be given to many others. Namely, there's Jeremy Girard, who handles the sales and marketing for the company, as well as artist Nate Baertsch. There's also photographer 16Shooter and toy reviewer Dorklair, among others. And any names that I've left out, I'll be happy to add later on in the video description next to the social media links of the individuals I just mentioned. Much of the information in this video can be found across various other videos as well as internet sites, not the least of which is the official Source Horseman website itself. Now, while the goal of Toy Connections has always been to document the history of toys in the vintage era, it's still important to document the history of toys today that are adding to this rich history. For some backstory, as a company, Four Horsemen Studios was founded back in 1999, long before the days of Mythic Legions and their own other in-house intellectual properties. The founding members were toy fans turned sculptors who had met even before the company's 1999 formation, all the way back to when they were working at McFarlane Toys. McFarlane, of course, is a company whose own founder trailblazed his way into the action figure industry at a time when giants like Hasbro were the main game in town. The Horsemen would eventually take their business over to Mattel, where they'd continue honing their craft and were instrumental in the figure sculpts for the early 2000s Masters of the Universe toy line, also dubbed as the 2000X line. Their work for Mattel would continue right through the Masters of the Universe Classics line that launched in 2008 and continued for many years after. You will see some homages and similarities for Mythic Legions figures that pay tribute to some classic Masters of the Universe characters, and it's convenient for fans that Legions figures happen to scale well with the Motu Classics as well as Motu Masterverse figures. Thus, while Mythic Legions has its own lore and backstory, some fans are content to use them to be intermixed with their He-Man favorites. Of course, the Horsemen would continue to work for and maintain relationships with other significant action figure companies, and in the years leading up to the birth of Mythic Legions, they'd have other IPs such as Magma Corps, Gothropolis, Seventh Kingdom, and others. Though to most fans, Mythic Legions is the flagship brand of this company. Many people simply buy Mythic Legions because they look good and display nicely, or because the fans have a pre-existing love for knights, orcs, skeletons, and barbarians, or because they scale well with other 6.5-inch figures. But the toy line does have its own built-in story, much of which can be summarized in the aforementioned Source Horseman website, for which many images in this video have come from, and the shorter character bios that are also packed in with the figures include some storyline as well. Now, as far as the lore and storyline goes, Mythic Legions is set in the fictional realm of Mythos. Since the line is high fantasy as well as sword and sorcery in terms of its style and feel, Mythos seems to be their equivalent of Middle-earth for Lord of the Rings or Westeros if you're making comparisons with the Game of Thrones franchise. Jeremy Girard has previously told the story in videos before, but it's a fun tale that's still worth discussing here again. The tale begins with immortal gods and goddesses inhabiting the universe at the beginning of time. While initially feeling something of a lonesome or unfulfilling existence, two gods come into contact with one another, namely Helios, the male, and Selene, the female. Having had children of their own, Selene displayed a love for these children. Meanwhile, Helios would grow resentful of Selene's devotion towards the children and sought to destroy them in order to reacquire Selene's undivided attention. As such, Helios created abomination-style, monster-like beings to destroy the world of Mythos that he and Selene had built. 4 of those dark abominations that Helios created were the very personifications representing the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse themselves, who of course are in parallel with what's been told in the Bible. For the purpose of Mythic Legions, these personifications are Arethyr, who represents war, Necronominus, who signifies death, Illythia, who is the characterization of famine, and then Poxxus, the embodiment of pestilence. Naturally, all of this works as something of a nod to the Four Horsemen company name itself. Note that the 4 evil creatures also represent the names of some of the factions that are key to the Mythic Legions toy line. Thus, these are the 4 evil factions that worked to destroy Mythos previously, but immediately aligned against each of these was an opposing heroic faction, each led by a legendary hero. Rising up to fight the evil armies, the dark forces of the 4 evil armies were banished, and many of the details about the final battles were lost over time, essentially becoming the equivalent of folklore in the realm of Mythos. The present-day armies are named after each of these legendary heroes in their heroic ranks, and as the days go by, the rumors continue to grow about the return of the malevolent forces led by the 4 evil beings, i.e. the personifications of the 4 horsemen mentioned previously. And with that, we can talk about the various factions. There's the 4 evil factions that we talked about, as well as the 4 main heroic factions that were led by the heroes of Mythos that were mentioned earlier. And in addition, there are 2 Splinter factions, which includes a more barbarian-looking faction that lives in the outskirts and wastelands of Mythos, as well as an assassin group consisting of mercenaries for hire. All of that gives us a grand total of 10 factions. For a brief overview of each group, we can start by looking at the Army of Leodysseus, who were named after one of the 4 legendary heroes that had saved Mythos in the olden days. The Army of Leodysseus represents a more organized, militaristic feel with fancy armor and weapons. They're led by Attila, who wields the large Leoser hammer and is in command due to his older brother Atlas having renounced his mantle of leadership to the faction, thus allowing his charismatic younger brother to step up and take the task. Immediately opposite to the Army of Leodysseus is the Legion of Arethyr, and at the forefront of this faction, of course, is Arethyr himself, the fiery embodiment of war and wielding the mighty Ether Blade. He has a lot of forces at his disposal, including goblins, orcs, and other creatures, and right by his side is the commander of his armies, who is named Gorgo. For any of these factions, just have a scroll through the sourcehorseman.com website and browse the selection of characters for which you can take a deeper look at. Another heroic faction is the Order of Eathyron. They're a conglomeration of knights, along with Templars, mystics, and others, and the order is led by a crusader named Sir Gideon Heavensbrand. Many of the characters have the Templar cross on their armor and are heavily crusade-themed and inspired. The order is named after Eathyron himself, the ancient battle god who wielded the powerful and purifying Heavensbrand sword. Here's a look at the Eathyron figure itself. The Order of Eathyron's natural enemy is the Congregation of Necronominus. A largely skeleton-heavy faction, they follow the embodiment of the Horseman of Death, which is Necronominus himself, who of course is one of the Dark Four to return to the realm of Mythos after having previously fallen during ancient times. The Congregation has several significant characters, including the High Priestess Morgulith, who serves as the leader of this congregation and who also happens to be a child of Necronominus himself. And then there's also Hagnon, who's seen multiple versions of himself released as a figure and is someone who, in a former life, was actually a member of the Order of Eathyron. You then have Xylona's flock, which is a grouping that's more nature-oriented. On the surface, they largely consist of elven races and some various other creatures, though among their ranks also are Xenethon, who's the Motu Stratos tribute figure, and Dubon, a human ranger with his bird companion. The flock take their name from Xylona, a female legendary beast who was one of the 4 ancient heroes that saved Mythos way back in the day. Though in the present timeline, her flock is led by the princess known as Artemis Silvercord. The flock's key enemy would be Illythia's brood, named after Illythia, who's the legendary personification of the Horsemen of Famine. The brood is, unsurprisingly, largely vampire-themed and are described as a faction whose constant hunger drains the life from others. The brood is led on a day-to-day basis by the warmonger called Lucretia, and she's also the daughter of the brood's very own Baron Voligar. That said, there's also the vampiric war hero known as Lord Dragul, who bears some semblance to Hordak from the She-Ra franchise, and Dragul is resentful of Lucretia's leadership, and thus he seeks his own personal quest for power. Named after the hero Bassylia, the Convocation of Bassylia is by and large a wizardry and magical arts faction. They're led in the main timeline by Hera Serpentspire, a powerful priestess and mage. There are also mystical beings such as the dragon-like Arakagor, who's larger than other figures, and there's also the more classic-looking wizards like the bookkeeper and librarian of the faction, who goes by the name of Samir Scrollwarder. The last of the true evil factions here is the Circle of Poxxus. As implied, they're named after Poxxus himself, who's the horseman embodiment of pestilence. It's an interesting grouping that consists of witches, demons, and shadow elves, with several key characters. For example, there's the demon brothers known as Azar and Zazar, who also have a combined Demon King form that serves as a faction commander. You've also got Zarya, who's another demon general, and then Malachi Cinderhorn, who's the king of the Shadow Elves. And getting to the final 2 Splinter factions, you can start with the House of the Noble Bear. The banished leader from the Army of Leodysseus, namely Atlas the Conqueror, is now the barbarian king leading the House of the Noble Bear group. This is a ragtag conglomeration of outcasts and renegades living in the outskirts of Mythos, though they do have some great characters like Bolthor the Tower, who's the giant figure, and Bodvar, who's the bear mount that's ridden by Atlas. There's also Adomon from the Colosseum wave of figures, who debuted back at PowerCon in 2017 and is a clear homage to He-Man. Adomon has now become one of the pricier figures that you'll find on the secondary market. The last official faction in Mythic Legions is the assassin mercenary group known as the Sons of the Red Star. They're led by Scapular, who's a former member of the Congregation of Necronominus and who also has a past history with Atlas. By his side are those such as the Dark Templar commander Sir Girard, who happens to be named after the Four Horsemen company's own Jeremy Girard, who admitted in the past that the Sons of the Red Star are his favorite faction. And this faction has a tribute figure of its own, namely Keltus, who's clearly an homage to Skeletor and was the other PowerCon 2017 debut figure that now commands a high price on the secondary market. As a personal story, I found one of these at the Victoria's Ultimate Hobby and Toy Fair up in Western Canada during the fall of 2023 for well under market value and snagged it immediately. While that covers the 10 factions, there's also a series of non-specific faction figures, not the least of which is the character simply called the Unknown One, who made his debut back at Legions Con in 2022. As one looks at Mythic Legions as a whole, it's worth exploring the lore of the franchise in an overview format like this so that new fans can know what they're getting into, and also for existing fans to have yet another source to reference, as I've elected to tell this in the Toy Connection's narration style. I personally began collecting Mythic Legions back in 2020, and normally I like to tell of toy histories as a reasonably complete, self-contained tale when it comes to vintage runs. But the story and history of Mythic Legions is still being written into present times. As such, I felt that a comprehensive introductory segment like this was more than worth my time and effort. Four Horsemen Studios has and will continue to bring us more stories occurring in the realm of Mythos, whether you choose to follow the story itself or simply have an appreciation for the figures due to their photogenic, aesthetic nature. And add to this, the Four Horsemen have gone on to expand their reach with other comparable lines such as the space-themed Cosmic Legions, as well as the Figura Obscura line, which brings in characters from our real-world folklore. While this video presentation has served as a bit of a window into the past and how we got to where we are today, trust that there will be plenty more to discuss as the years go on. Please do comment below and tell us whatever your favorite character or faction from Mythic Legions is. And if you happen to like this video, you can continue your Toy Connections viewing experience by having a look at this Mythic Legions related conversation right over here, or for a look at some toy histories, you can have a look at this playlist right over here. And with that, I'll see you all next time. Thanks for watching, and take care.